and I am an animal behaviourist in the southeast of England. So I run a company called Animal Behaviour Kent, and we do dog and cat behaviour consulting throughout kind of Kent, Surrey, East Sussex, and most areas in South London. I'm also a member of the IAABC, which is the International Association of Animal Behaviour Consultants. And I'm also a student member of the Association of Pet Behaviour Counsellors. So there's quite a few different organisations out there, animal behaviour. So try to keep up with a few of them. So I'm going to get started fairly quickly, as there's quite a lot to get through today. Just to give you a bit of an idea of what we're going to be covering, we're going to start off by just looking at kind of what is separation anxiety, and what that means when we're talking about separation anxiety in our dogs. We're then going to have a look at why it might occur in our dogs, so in terms of what sort of factors might lead to separation anxiety developing in dogs. So we're then going to have a little look at some common myths about separation anxiety, because there's lots of different sort of myths out there in terms of sort of what might cause and what might lead to sort of separation anxiety developing, and how to treat separation anxiety as well. There's plenty of myths about how to treat separation anxiety that we'll try and get through some of them. And then the final thing we're going to be looking at is kind of how to identify separation anxiety and what to do if your dog is experiencing separation anxiety as well, and where to kind of go from there. And we also haven't put it on there, unfortunately, but we're going to be doing a Q&A afterwards. So the first part of this webinar is going to be obviously going through the content, and the second part, we're going to try and get through as many questions as possible. And I do apologise that we probably won't be able to get through everyone's questions, as there are quite a lot of you here, but we'll get through as many as possible. And hopefully, if you aren't able to have your question answered, we provide lots of resources at the end of this, so you'll be able to go away and find some of your own answers as well. So the first thing we're going to be looking at is kind of what is separation anxiety. So separation anxiety is when an animal, and in this case particularly a dog, experiences distress in the absence of their owner or caregivers, or in the presence of cues that predict being left alone. So that might be something that happens that tells the dog that they're about to be left, and that can actually start causing that anxiety and distress response as well. So when we're talking about distress, that can be fear, that can be anxiety. So that's kind of fear is particularly when an animal's seeing that kind of thing right in front of them that's causing that distress. So it might be that actually being left alone is in itself a fear-provoking experience for an animal. It might be an anxiety response. And anxiety is when an animal or a person is thinking about what's going to happen in the future, or sort of preempting a dangerous thing happening. So it might be that being left alone leads to the dog thinking, oh, something really, really bad's about to happen in the future, or something really terrible is going to happen when I'm left alone. So it's kind of a small bit of a difference, kind of a sort of almost really, really small difference, but it's quite important when we're understanding separation anxiety or separation distress. And also a phobia. And a phobia is sort of what's known as a really maladaptive response, a really disproportionate response in relation to the stimuli. So again, if particularly animals or a dog's responding really, really extremely, then it might be getting onto that level of becoming a true phobia in that situation of being alone. So that's a bit of an overview of kind of what separation anxiety is, and I think probably if you've ever seen a dog with separation anxiety, there's lots of different kind of ways that might present itself. So I've got a bit of a video here, which is kindly donated to me by another member of the Association of Pet Behaviour Counsellors, of a dog experiencing some separation anxiety. And this obviously isn't going to be what every dog experiences. It's kind of obviously a very personal experience to each dog in terms of how they respond when they're experiencing that distress. But this is just one thing that you might see during a separation anxiety incident. So this dog does a lot of pacing. This dog does a lot of barking, jumping around, jumping up on the counters. Looking at the window as well, which is a really, really common thing, to kind of be looking at the window, barking, almost trying to escape. Brilliant. So as you can see, so this dog just being left alone, there's no scary thing there, there's no big sort of threat, obvious threat. It's just that isolation from the owner is causing that dog distress. And that's what we're really going to be looking at today, when we see these dogs that are isolated from their owners or separated from their owners, and how it really kind of causes that distress for them and why it causes that distress for them. Okay, so there's two kind of forms of separation anxiety that we're really going to focus on today, and a lady called Melina DiMartini-Price sort of categorized these really, really nicely in a recent book she wrote, which is a really kind of useful way of understanding separation anxiety. So the two forms that we kind of really focus on are clinical separation anxiety. So this is when the dog displays distress when they're separated from a specific attachment figure. So that might be something like the owner or the primary caregiver of the dog. And the dog, even if it's with other people or left alone with other people, still experiences distress if they're away from that specific attachment figure. So that's a really, really tough thing to deal with, because it means the dog's going to be anxious unless they're with that maybe one or maybe two people, which makes it really tough. Isolation distress is a slightly different form, and it's probably the more common form of separation anxiety. And this is kind of when the distress that you see when the animals or when the dog's completely left alone with no other humans. So it only happens when the dog's entirely on their own. So that means if you put the dog in a daycare or someone comes and looks after the dog actually copes all right. It's just when they're entirely alone that you get those problems. So, and that's quite a good way of kind of defining separation anxiety and understanding the different forms of separation anxiety that different dogs might see. And for those of you that are dog owners, it's probably worth having a think about whether your dog experiences clinical separation anxiety or that kind of more isolation distress form of separation anxiety. So what triggers this anxious response? So there's lots of actually things, although we are really dealing with that one stimuli of the separation, there is also lots of different things that actually can start triggering that anxious response in dogs. So before you even step out the door and before you even present the dog with the absence, a lot of dogs start feeling anxiety or start feeling fearful and start displaying those panic symptoms. So those kind of cues that the dog's picking up on that's causing them to experience those panic symptoms are what's known as departure cues. And it's really, really interesting to kind of be aware of these and be aware of how our dogs might pick up on these and use these as cues to let them know that something bad in their mind by the absence is about to happen. So it can be things like shoes being put on, it can be things like keys jangling, and you're welcome to us as well, put in the chat box if there's any departure cues for dog owners that you're aware that your dog's particularly aware of in your own household. So it'd be always interesting to hear. But some of the really, really common ones are shoes being put on, keys jangling, coats being put on. Also, for example, things like different perfumes, different aftershaves, and different clothes. So if owners are planning on maybe going on a night out or something like that the dog wouldn't normally come along to, dogs tend to be pretty good at picking up on that sort of different routine of getting ready, wearing different things, owners smelling a bit different. Also things like the owners packing their bags. Also, if the dog's been put in a specific room or area that might be where they're left when the owners leave the dog alone. Also, the dog might notice you not doing something that you normally do. So, for example, not picking up the lead, not picking up the dog's harness, and that might start causing the dog anxiety, because that's where the dog might start realizing that, again, that bad thing in their mind of being left is about to happen. And so it can really be whatever tells your dog that you're going out. And again, these are just some ideas of some common departure cues, but there's many different things that your dog could be picking up on that actually tells them that you're going out. And you almost have to turn into a bit of a detective when you're dealing with separation anxiety to actually work out what these cues that your dog's picking up on are. So someone's just mentioned that their dog's major cue is that they don't put on any pants, which are not leggings or PJ pants normally. So he knows that she dresses a bit differently if they're staying home. So that's a really key one, that kind of different sort of wardrobe attire that comes into it can be a really, really big clue for dogs, and they get so good at picking up on it. Oh, and someone else has put, which is a really good one as well, is face masks. So yeah, face masks can be a big cue because obviously if you're going out for a dog walk, you might not need a face mask. Whereas if you're going out to go to the shops or something like that and the dog can't come along to you, then you're more likely to be wearing a face mask, depending on what country you're in and the different legislation on that is. Someone else has mentioned schedule or routine, which is a key one as well. Yes, a dog might know in the morning we go for a walk, in the afternoon you go out to work sometimes, and that's terrifying. Someone's mentioned work alarm, picking up lunch bag, brushing their teeth. So yeah, there's so many different ones. So it's super, super interesting trying to think about what those different things that your dog might be picking up on are. So how common is it that dogs experience these things or experience this form of anxiety? So it's actually a really, really common condition, and it's, I think, surprisingly common, and also I think surprisingly under-identified, that dogs are experiencing separation anxiety, because of course it happens primarily when owners aren't in the home and when you guys aren't in the home. So actually spotting separation anxiety can sometimes be quite difficult. But evidence does suggest that around 50% of dogs experience separation-related problems at some point throughout their life. So that's not to say 50% of dogs have separation anxiety right now, but at some point throughout their life, around 50% of dogs are likely to develop some sort of separation-related problems, which is an astronomical amount of dogs. So it's a really, really common condition. It's a really, really prevalent condition, and it's really can be really stressful for the dog, obviously, and the owners as well in terms of dealing with that. So what are the most frequent signs that we kind of see during those absences and those separations? So there's a really interesting study that came out just last year that looked at kind of some of the most common frequent signs of separation anxiety. Now, the most common one, which is probably not a surprise, is actually vocalization. So that's when the dog's making noise. That might be barking, that might be whining, that might be, I don't know if anyone's heard their dog kind of literally screaming almost during that kind of separation, which can be really, really distressing to hear, and obviously very distressing for the dog. So barking, whining, just sort of all those different distress sounds are prevalent or seen, or present, sorry, in about 78% of cases of separation anxiety. So that's a really, really common sign of dogs that are experiencing separation anxiety. And the most interesting finding, I think, in this one is the second one down, which is depression. So basically, this is when the dog kind of just shuts down a little bit and just kind of maybe goes, withdraws, hides, doesn't do all their kind of normal things that they would normally do, like wandering around the house, exploring, doing normal stuff. And I think this is a really, really important one to be aware of, because for this, there's probably the least amount of kind of physical signs for owners to pick up on in terms of spotting and identifying this separation anxiety, because the dog's actually doing what some people would consider quite a good thing of just lying down and hiding maybe in their bed or something like that. But it doesn't mean that internally they're not experiencing that anxiety and that distress. So it's not a good place for the dog to be in, and it still does need support, and the dog still does need support to overcome this, so they're not kind of going through that stressful response every single time the owner leaves. But again, it's a really, really hard one to spot. Destruction is another really common one. So that's about 45% of cases, and that can be things like door frames are really, really common. So that kind of often comes up in a bit of an escape attempt of the dog trying to get out, maybe to get to the owner. Also things like carpets and just general things around the house. Often that kind of chewing behaviour, that kind of destroying behaviour, just relieves that anxiety slightly. So it can be kind of almost like just a way just to get a little bit of relief from that anxiety for the dogs. Another really common one is urination and also defecation. So when the dog wees and poos indoors, and that's 28% of cases roughly on urination, and about 20% of cases that we get the defecation. And again, that's a really, really common one that owners are more likely to notice, because of course that's going to be there when you get back. And obviously it's not a good place for the dog to be in, to be having accidents indoors. So why do dogs kind of develop this separation anxiety? Why is it so common in dogs? Why are so many of our dogs displaying these signs? And I think one of the key reasons for this is dogs haven't really evolved to be left alone. So dogs are a really social species. They've kind of evolved to live in groups, like family groups, and kind of, yeah, different sorts of groups, because this kind of helps with their survival. If you're in a group, you're more likely to survive a threatening thing like a predator or something like that, or as well as something like some sort of natural disaster or something like that. Having other experienced kind of group members there is really, really good, and it helps a dog deal with kind of those stresses in life. And it also means they can do things like sharing food and sharing resources and sharing warmth as well. So it's got lots and lots of benefits living in a group, especially if you're a dog that does things like hunting and foraging for food. So being able to kind of live in that group environment is very, very ingrained in their behaviour. And we know that around 50% of free-ranging dogs spend their whole life with their family group. So they don't ever really leave this family group. They kind of grow up in this family group, they stick with it. They don't ever really have any big absences from their family. They just kind of stick with them most of the time. And even the dogs that do disperse from their family tend to do this about 13 months of age. So it's not a young thing that a dog will leave their family group. And when they do disperse, they tend to find a new group as well, potentially making a new family group. So we also know that they're really, really good at doing things like sharing things like caring responsibilities. So that's called alloparental care. So things like sort of biological grandmother dogs and kind of aunt and uncle dogs are really good at kind of stepping in and helping care for things like offspring as well. We know that juvenile dogs, so that's up to 1 year old, tend to stay quite close to the adult dogs when they're out foraging. So again, a really, really useful thing for keeping them safe and also for learning how to do things like foraging, which is obviously another key thing for survival. And foraging also usually takes place in groups. So foraging is the biggest food source really for free-ranging dogs, foraging and scavenging. And that usually takes place in groups, and it's usually got kind of set groups. And also dogs are regularly seen sleeping in close proximity to each other, which is again another really smart behavior, because if you sleep, you're slightly more vulnerable. So if you've got another person there or another dog there, sorry, to share some of that vigilance, then that's going to make it much easier for you to stay safe. I'm sorry, so I'm just seeing quite a few questions are popping up on the chat. I will try and answer them afterwards, but there's also a Q&A box. So if you put them in there, it'll be a little bit easier for me to kind of see them at the end and answer them as well, if that's all right. Thank you. So dogs are really, really social animals. So when they're kind of left alone, when we maybe go out to work or go out to the shops or go through those kind of daily tasks that we do, that can seem really abnormal for them, because they've kind of evolved with humans to kind of see humans as part of their kind of family groups, in the same way that they'd see maybe another dog, or a similar way that they'd see another dog or a parent as part of their family groups. So it can, for some dogs, be really, really scary, because they've got this kind of social behavior really hardwired into them. So the other thing that we know contributes to separation anxiety is the dog's development. So how those kind of really early experiences that the dogs go through up to around a year of age. So we know that dogs develop really, really strong attachment bonds to humans. And by attachment bonds, we're talking about those kind of bonding and that kind of trust bond that babies make with other humans. So like a mother would make with their own child. And basically what that allows is for the child to feel more confident in their daily life. It allows them to kind of feel much more able to explore the world and get used to the world, because they kind of learn that their parent is going to look after them. And dogs have really, really cleverly evolved to do a similar thing with humans. So they've learned that if they hang around humans and if they form a strong attachment with one of the humans, with their human, sorry, or their human or humans, then that allows them to kind of feel safe in the world, explore the world safely, and feel more confident around the world. And if dogs don't have that attachment and they don't have that kind of trust bond with humans, then it's going to be much harder for them to actually cope with things like their human going away, because they haven't got that strong attachment, they don't necessarily have that trust in place that's going to support them in feeling confident that their human's going to come back and not leave them and not abandon them forever, if that kind of makes sense. So we also know that kind of this attachment relationship in humans has been linked to things like self-regulation abilities, and it's also got the really good protective effect against things like mental ill health. And this hasn't been studied a whole lot in dogs, but I think it's fairly likely that there's a very similar response. So there's a bit of research to say that there is, the more and more research is coming out that I think is going to probably start really showing a strong link between attachment in dogs and that kind of level of bonding that they've got to their humans and their chances of developing things like behavioural problems and difficulties with things like self-regulation. So the stronger a dog's attachment to their human, the less likely generally, or most likely, hopefully, they are to develop separation-related problems. Also, one kind of, and this is kind of jumping the gun a little bit because this goes into that kind of myth-busting aspect of the presentation, but one of those kind of big myths around separation anxiety is that if you've got a dog that's really kind of hyper-attached to the human, really bonded closely to the human, then they're more likely to develop separation anxiety. But that's actually not true. So there's been some really good research done that kind of shows that if you've got dogs that are really bonded to a human, they're no more likely to develop separation anxiety. And in fact, if the dog has a really strong attachment to the human, then actually that's probably the best thing for helping the dog resolve it longer term and for making the behavioural modification aspect of resolving that separation anxiety successful. So if you're interested in that, it's a study by Partha Sarathi and Crowell Davis in 2006, which is really interesting to have a read of if you're kind of interested in that little myth and how essentially attachment is not linked, or strong attachments is not linked to dogs being more likely to develop separation anxiety. So the more you can promote that really strong bond between your dog and the owner, the better for preventing separation anxiety. It's the kind of the big message there. So now we're going to have a little look at some of those common myths about separation anxiety, because there's certainly a lot of them out there. So the first one that I certainly hear quite a lot is that if you adopt an older dog, they're more likely to develop separation anxiety. And this one we can deal with really quickly, because this has actually been looked into by quite a few different researchers. And there's absolutely no evidence that older dogs are any more likely to develop separation anxiety. Similarly, dogs with previous homes, with even more previous homes, aren't any more likely to develop separation anxiety. So adopting an older dog isn't kind of like a death sentence for them to develop separation anxiety by any means. It's not to say they won't. They're just as likely as any other dog to develop separation anxiety, but it doesn't increase your odds. It doesn't make them more likely to develop separation anxiety. So the second one that we hear lots and lots is that dogs develop separation anxiety because they're spoiled. So when we're kind of saying spoil, that might be things like letting the dog on the bed, feeding the dog at the table, all those kind of things that are typically associated with spoiling a dog. But again, this has also been looked into, which is really good. And again, research has kind of shown us that spoiling activities have no association with separation anxiety. And actually, what's really interesting is the opposite might be true, because spoiling activities are only going to strengthen your dog's trust in you as a predictor of good things. So that's going to enhance that attachment bond between the owner and the dog, which is, again, hopefully going to allow the dog to trust the owner more, and hopefully will allow the dog to feel more confident in those separations, because, again, they've got that trust in the owner, they've got that confidence that hopefully the owner's going to come back. So it's going to better prepare them to cope with absences, actually, if you do things that are maybe a little bit spoily, because although, yeah, it might lead to your dog learning to do something like jumping up at the table, which isn't great. If you are being a little bit more spoiling, whatever that might be, letting them on the sofa, letting them jump in the bed, that's only going to strengthen their bond with you and only going to make them feel more confident that you're not going to abandon them, you're not going to do anything, you're not going to put them in danger, you're not going to cause anything bad to happen to them. So kind of the third myth is, again, a really common one and something that people often do, which is, I think, can be a bit unfortunate because it doesn't normally work. Yes, so the myth is that getting another dog is going to help with the separation anxiety. And again, weirdly enough, presence of other pets in the home is not associated with reduced incidence of separation anxiety. It very rarely seems to have any effect in terms of helping a dog that already has separation anxiety or preventing a dog from developing separation anxiety, which is a shame because obviously that would be such a lovely solution if we could just get our dogs another dog and cure that separation anxiety. But unfortunately, that doesn't happen very often. And unfortunately, it can actually backfire a little bit because if you adopt another dog simply to just try and treat that separation anxiety, that actually might provide more stress for the family because obviously now they've got an extra dog to take care of. So you've got a dog with separation anxiety and you've got a new dog to settle into the house, which is just going to add more stress for you and potentially make it harder for you to kind of allocate the time that you need to treat that separation anxiety. I do think if you're thinking about getting another dog already and you're prepared to take on another dog and you're planning to take on another dog, then it's not going to do any harm and it's not going to make the separation anxiety worse. So by all means, go ahead. But I don't think it's a good idea to go in kind of expecting that getting another dog is going to help the separation anxiety of your first dog. So another really common one is that the dog is punishing you for going out. So this idea that the dog is really, really cross with the owner for going out. So he's going to wee everywhere and poo everywhere and to do all that sort of thing, destroy the furniture or whatever the dog does, to let the owner know that they really weren't happy about them going out and really are really cross about it and just not stop them from doing it again. And unfortunately, dogs aren't actually, sadly, and they don't really have the brain capacity to come up with something like that, right? So for kind of a few reasons, generally they're not very good at thinking about the future. They're quite good at those sorts of instant behaviour and response sort of chains. So a dog's not really going to know if they go to the toilet in the house when you come back hours later that you're going to be cross about that. They'll know that when you come back, you're cross. They'll figure out that, yeah, you seem to be in a really bad mood when you got back. But they're not going to know it's because they went for a poo 3 hours ago. It's not going to register, right? We also, they're not going to. Yes, they're not going to figure out that that's going to upset you. So they're not going to be able to clever enough to think, oh, I'm going to go for a poo because that's going to upset my owner, and then they won't leave me again. And we also know that they don't know things like going for a poo or destroying the furniture is upsetting to us, right? So if you've seen a dog do like go to the toilet or something like that down the dog park, generally they're pretty pleased with themselves, right? Generally they're like, oh, hey, other dogs, come over here, come and have a sniff of this, isn't this great? Or look what I found and destroyed, look at this twig I found and destroyed. This is all great stuff for them to do. So they're not going to realise that it's going to be in any way upsetting for us. So yeah, dogs really, that's just not the way they think and not the way they work, that they're going to be able to come up with a way to spite us in that way by doing something like destroying the house or going to the toilet in the house to stop us going out again. And we also know that because they can't do this kind of mental time travel, if you come home and you tell your dog off for pooing or destroying the furniture, again, because they've done it 3 hours ago or because they've done it ages ago, they're not going to realise what you're talking about. They're just going to realise you were really angry when you came home, and that could potentially make the separation anxiety worse because now your dog's sitting at home thinking, oh my God, my owner's going to be so mad when he comes in. He always is, or she always is so mad when she comes in after going out. Now I really need to panic. So really, really trying to avoid that idea of punishing your dog, really, really trying to avoid thinking that your dog's trying to punish you because, again, they're not. They just haven't, they wouldn't be able to think of it. It just doesn't make sense. So another common one is this idea that getting a crate is going to solve the problem. So again, unfortunately, this doesn't really ever seem to solve the separation anxiety problem. So confinement quite often increases feelings of anxiety in dogs. So there's some really interesting research showing that I haven't referenced here annoyingly, but what I'll do is I'll put it in the notes on the YouTube video. But some really interesting research showing that confinement anxiety is really, really, really commonly associated with separation anxiety. So they really are quite hand in hand as problems. So if we're going to treat separation anxiety, we don't want to add anything else that's going to add to the dog's sense of anxiety to start with. So removing as much confinement and allowing the dog to feel free as much as possible is generally going to be the most conducive thing to helping them overcome that anxiety. And we also know, yeah, it does have the benefit of being in a crate. If you've got a dog that maybe wheezes or poos everywhere or chews up all the furniture, if you put them in a crate, that's going to prevent them from displaying some of that separation-related behaviour, that distress behaviour, right? But it doesn't mean that they're not feeling anxious. It just means that they can't do the normal things that they do to cope in that situation. And sometimes that results in the dog kind of shutting down and maybe going for that more of that depression response. And sometimes it results in them doing things like destroying the crate or going into something like self-mutilation or something like that, because again, they've got less options in terms of ways to cope. They haven't got the house that they can destroy, so they find something else to do to cope. And there's some really sort of unfortunately really kind of horrific images out there of dogs kind of almost like really injuring themselves trying to get out of crates as well. So again, it's not going to solve the problem. It might prevent the problem from being so visible, but it's not going to solve it. And the final one, which is quite a nice one to be a myth, is that dogs with separation anxiety cannot be helped. And yeah, this is really, really luckily is a myth, because actually there's lots of successful things and lots of successful treatments to help dogs with separation anxiety and help them feel much more comfortable with being left alone. So I'm really glad to say that is a myth, and there is a lot we can do to help our dogs in that situation. So how do we identify separation anxiety? And that's what we're going to look at now. And there's quite a few things we need to consider when we're identifying separation anxiety. So the first thing that's really, really important to get is a medical rule out, because actually there's lots and lots of medical conditions that could lead to a dog displaying some behaviours which might be labelled as separation anxiety. So, for example, incontinence is an obvious one, because if you've got a dog that can't control their bowels, then that might lead to them going to the toilet when they're home alone. It might seem like that's a separation-related behaviour, but obviously they've just got incontinence. Dental pain is another common one. So if a dog's experiencing dental pain, then they might chew on things to help reduce that pain. And again, that might mean chewing on the furniture, chewing up the door frames, doing something like that. So again, it can sometimes mislead us and lead us to kind of assuming it's separation anxiety when it's not. So getting that medical rule out is really, really key. The other important one to look out for is pregnancy, because that might lead to things like nesting behaviour. So that can be sometimes result in destruction at the home and the dog trying to kind of nest around the home as well, which is an interesting one. Also, cognitive dysfunction is a common one as well, which can often be kind of mistaken for separation anxiety, because again, the dog might be going to the toilet around the home or destroying things around the home, but again, that might just be a result of them getting a little bit confused, unfortunately. So getting that medical rule out is a really, really key first step in identifying separation anxiety, to make sure there's no other causes of the dog's behaviour, or if there are other causes of the dog's behaviour, because sometimes it can be there's multiple causes. Sometimes it might be that actually your dog has got some dental pain, but has also got separation anxiety. They're not mutually exclusive. But making sure that you're aware of any other potential causes and treating other potential causes, if there are any, as well, is really, really key. Because if you've got a dog that's got some sort of endocrine disease or something like that, and you're treating them for separation anxiety, it's not going to be very useful, unfortunately. So speaking to your vet, getting a full checkup and making sure the dog's happy, healthy and well is the first step. The next step is a behavioural rule out. So making sure there's no other kind of behavioural things going on with the dog that's leading them to display some of those behaviours. So again, some common ones are things like, so if the dog's playing, so it might be that you've got a very playful dog and maybe we need to leave more things out to make sure the dog's directing their play at appropriate things. And the reason the dog likes to sit on the cushions is because they're the sort of dog that likes kind of dissecting things or something like that. And maybe we need to get them something like a bone or something really fun to dissect that they can have when they're at home. Another one is kind of if the dog's being left to get a little bit bored, so if the dog's being just left for too long on their own, it might not be that they're anxious, it might just be that they're getting really, really bored because they haven't got enough stimulation through the day, they haven't got enough contact with humans. It might be teething pain, so this is common in puppies. Teething pain will lead to a puppy again wanting to chew on things to get some relief from that, so that might lead to them chewing around the home. It might be that they're attempting to thermoregulate. So if the house is too cold or too hot, too cold in particular might lead to a dog destroying things like cushions and stacking up all your cushions and burying into the sofa or something like that to try and warm up. So actually thinking about the temperature of the home is a really important one as well. It might be a different sort of anxiety. So it might be a noise phobia or a storm phobia or something like that. It might be that your dog's developed a phobia of something like the bin men. Or the bin workers, I should say, in the sense that, and that's leading to that anxious response, and it just happens to occur when you go out, and that's why you don't know that it's the bin people as such. Incomplete house training, so it might just be that you haven't quite finished teaching a puppy to go to the toilet outside, and that's absolutely fine. It might just be that they need a little bit more work on it. If there's insufficient toilet access, so again, this comes into generally dogs that haven't been allowed to go out before the separation, they're being left maybe a bit too long for them or something like that. It also might be marking behaviour. So if it's a dog that's really, really commonly marking, maybe hasn't been given enough marking opportunities out and about or something like that, they might be actually just trying to mark. And that again can be linked to anxiety, marking behaviour, but it can also just be linked to dogs that really, really love marking, and that behaviour needs to maybe be a bit more taught in terms of where that's appropriate and where that isn't appropriate, ideally not in the house. As a general rule, I think most people can agree on. And then the next thing we're going to need to do to really work out if this is separation anxiety is observe the behaviour. So both the behaviour while the dog's left alone, but also the behaviour that just before the dog's being left alone as well. So really, really getting good at monitoring your dog's behaviour and monitoring as much as possible is really, really key to identifying whether this is separation anxiety that we're dealing with. And video recording is about the absolute best tool for this because obviously by nature of the condition, you can't be there and observe separation anxiety and see those behaviours because you need to not, your absence is the trigger of the anxiety. So getting a video camera, they're actually really, really cheap and reasonably priced now to record your dog and observe your dog when you are out is so, so useful for learning more about their behaviour and what's causing that behaviour and if it is separation anxiety. So what do we look out for when we're watching those videos and watching our dog's behaviour just before we leave? So generally just before you leave, you'll see kind of lower level signs of anxiety. So you might see some whining, some barking, some drooling as well, and things like panting, maybe the dog's shaking a lot as well. I haven't put that on there, but it's like quite commonly just shaking, if the dog, especially if the dog's not wet or got any reason to shake. Fast breathing as well, so kind of watch their respirations. Actually, is their breathing starting to get faster? And they might start eating more pickily, and particularly if it's a dog that's kind of learned, when you go out, you always leave a load of food out for me, and that's become a bit of a departure cue for them. So actually some dogs develop an aversion to food because they start to learn that actually the owner putting food out or putting a Kong out, putting something like that out is predicting them going out or leaving. And they quite often as well will start really, really hanging around in close proximity to the person about to leave. And then after you leave, you get really quite a myriad of different behaviours that a dog might experience while feeling anxious. And these are just some of them. But you might see whining, barking, drooling, depression. So that depression, again, is really key to look out for. Panting, fast breathing, picky eating, distressed vocalization. So whatever that might be that screaming, that whining, that barking, anything else. Trembling, shaking. So attempts to escape the house or the confinement area, destruction of anything around the home, urination, defecation, and also self-mutilation as well, which can be really distressing to see when you come back. But what I would say as well, which is really key with this, is that the behavioural presentation of that anxiety is only a symptom of the dog's emotional state, right? So there's no set behavior that we're looking out for in separation anxiety, because it's just how the dog feels. The dog's feeling anxious, and that normally will come out in things like whining, barking, drooling, depression, right? But that's just how it presents for some dogs. If you've got a dog that when they're anxious, they start, I don't know, maybe stacking, pulling all the chairs to the center of the room or something like that, and that's all, then that's still separation anxiety. It's just a slightly unusual, less common behavior that's occurring as a symptom of that anxiety. So there's not ever going to be an exhaustive list of symptoms, because different dogs will display their anxiety in different ways. And understanding, so it's really key to understand your dog, to know what their symptoms of stress are, what their symptoms of anxiety are when they are feeling anxious, and know if those are showing or those are presenting during an absence, then your dog is likely to be experiencing separation anxiety. We're just going to briefly have a little look at how we prevent separation anxiety. And sadly, this is a really tough question, because there's not a lot of conclusive research showing us how we can prevent separation anxiety, and it does seem to be quite random whether separation anxiety develops. But there are a few things that you can do to hopefully prevent and protect your dog against developing separation anxiety if they haven't already developed it. So the first thing is to build a strong attachment with your dog, and really can't emphasize enough how important it is to build that strong attachment with your dog. So really becoming a predictor of good things, really trying to avoid punishing your dog as well. So any sort of harsh punishment, physical punishment, anything that scares the dog essentially, because that's just going to teach your dog that you're scary and maybe less trustworthy. So it's going to put them in a position where they're less able to cope with those absences. To really build that attachment as well, you can do lots of fun activities with them, do lots of bonding with them, physical, tactile bonding. Touch is a great way to bond. Just showing them good things, playing fun games with them. There's lots you can do to really build up a relationship with them, and really hopefully give them that protective effect of a strong attachment bond when they are experiencing anxiety. The other good thing when you are trying to build up an attachment bond as well is just being really sensitive to their needs. So if your dog is looking worried, if your dog is looking distressed, going to them and checking on them, seeing how they're doing, seeing what you can do to help them as well. And when your dog is behaving calmly around the home, the more you can encourage that, the better. So if your dog's settling down, if your dog's having a little relax, the more you can praise them, the more you can reward them maybe with something like a little bit of a cuddle and a little bit of massage, something like that, to just really teach them that this is great when they're being calm. It's a great thing to do, the better, so they can really get good at being calm. Don't punish your dog when you return home, and we've already discussed this a little bit, but again, if you've got a dog that's anxious when you go away and knows that when you come home you're going to punish them for destroying the furniture or whatever they do, then that's just going to make them more anxious, because they have no idea how to stop that. They just know that you're going to be mad when you come home. Again, for dogs that don't have separation anxiety or haven't developed separation anxiety, it is good to provide the dog with things to do while you're away. So maybe offering things like a Kong, maybe offering things like a chew or a puzzle, and the dog can be left safely with, just so they've got something to do, making sure that a few of their toys are out, making sure their beds are available, some different sleeping spaces are available, so they've got some things to do and they don't become so bored that they start becoming really vigilant and start looking out for things that might add to that anxiety or start really becoming anxious. So it is quite good to give them things to do if you're in terms of from a preventative aspect. Again, if you've got a dog that's already got separation anxiety, it's a bit more difficult, because they might start seeing that stuff come out and they might start be thinking, oh, that means they're about to leave. So it can be tricky, but in terms of from a prevention perspective, it is useful to give them some things to do. Again, with a new dog, always try and build up those absences slowly. So start really small, start a couple of minutes, start less than a couple of minutes if you can. Start with seconds, and then just work up slowly on those absences, so you never overload them and shock them with one big absence. Because if you have a dog, if you adopt a new dog, bring them into your home, never leave, and then suddenly your first time you leave them for 4 hours, then it's never happened before and it's a massive thing for them to cope with. So it's much more likely that they're not going to cope well with it, and it's much more likely that they will experience anxiety or panic in that situation. And the other thing you can do is really make sure you're meeting your dog's behavioural needs. So the dog is in a good emotional place, and they're not stressed out, and they're feeling really happy. So again, they've got kind of hopefully a more optimistic attitude about life, and they're less concerned about something bad happening. So a good resource for thinking about meeting your dog's behavioural needs is something called the Canine Hierarchy of Needs, and this is an adapted version of something designed by Linda Michaels from Do No Harm Dog Training. And kind of the really key ones for separation anxiety to think about are really helping your dog feel safe around the home, so making sure that the home is a safe place for the dog and the dog feels really comfortable in all aspects of the home. Really making sure you really try and provide lots of love and trust for your dog, and really building up that trust and attachment bond with your dog, as we've kind of discussed. And making the environment as predictable as possible as well, so the dog really can predict what's going on and isn't kind of always trying to maybe guess the next bad thing, or in their mind bad thing that's going to happen. And also really encouraging bonding to people and really encouraging bonding to other dogs. So the more strong relationships they've got, the more trust that they've got in those relationships, the more protected hopefully they're going to be against separation anxiety. Okay, so what do you do if your dog already has separation anxiety? And this is a really tough question, and it's unfortunately not something we can fully discuss in the scope of this kind of short webinar, because there's so many things to consider, and a behaviour plan for each dog's always going to be different, because every dog is different and every dog's going to have different and respond to different things. But the best thing, or the best kind of 3-step process to go with, is to speak to your vet to make sure we account for any medical conditions that might be causing the problem, and treat those if possible, and rule them out if not. We then can hopefully get a referral to a behaviourist that can work with you and formulate a behaviour modification plan for your dog, that's with an understanding of your dog's triggers and an understanding of what's causing that anxiety specifically for your dog, to make your dog feel much more confident and give your dog the ability to cope around those separations. So there's lots of behaviourists out there, and there's, I've put together a little resources page for you here as well. So obviously the slides I'm going to make available on my website as well for you, so you can download this and get access to these resources. But if you're looking for a behaviourist to help you with separation anxiety, there's a couple of great consultant locators from the ABTC, which is the Animal Behaviour and Training Council, and also the IAABC, which is the International Association of Animal Behaviour Consultants. And again, the ABTC is specifically the UK. The IAABC have consultants all over the world. So they're both really good resources to check out, depending on where you are. If you're in the southeastern of England, obviously you're very welcome to contact me as well. And my company is Animal Behaviour Kent, and would always be very happy to take on any separation anxiety cases. For those people looking to learn more as well, another really great resource is a website by a lady called Julie Naismith. And she's got a website called Subthreshold Dog Training, and she's got released a book on separation anxiety, and she's also got a podcast with loads and loads of episodes talking about separation anxiety. There's also an interview on a blog called Companion Animal Psychology with a lady called Melina Di Martini Price about separation anxiety as well, which is definitely worth checking out if you want to learn a bit more. She's a really interesting lady, knows lots and lots about separation anxiety. So all the references for this presentation as well are at the end of the slides, and you're welcome to have a look through those. Okay, so I'm just going to stop the recording here, because we're just going to move on to any questions for those of you that have questions. I think that looks like there's quite a few already. Thank you so much for listening, and yeah, we'll get started on questions right away so we can get through as many as possible.